Welcome to the highlights from Chapter 2 as we look at economic models, trade-offs, and trades. So we're going to start off by looking at the production possibility frontier, this idea of the PPF or the PPC, production possibilities curve. This is showcasing two goods that are being produced and the trade-offs between them in terms of if we're going to produce good A and good B, we're going to have more of good A than we're going to have less of good B, and vice versa. If we produce more of good B, we'd have less production of good A. So this is demonstrated in what we call a production possibilities curve or a production possibilities frontier, a PPC or a PPF. It is bowed out because we have increasing opportunity cost with every additional item that is produced. So in this case, we have good X and good Y, and if we're producing more of good X, we are doing it at the expense of good Y. And vice versa, if we're producing more of good Y, we would be doing it at the expense of good X. And so the importance here is really showcasing the idea that there are trade-offs between these two goods. So notice in point A, we would be inefficient if we were producing at point A because we're neither producing what we are capable of good X or of good Y, or both. And so we are inefficient in that market. We are not efficient in using our resources. Point D, not an option. Right now, at least, we do not have the production capabilities to produce at point D. Now, maybe 20 years from now, we'll have the technology such that this PPF will move outward to reach point D, and the new curve will actually be out here at point D, intersecting point D at some point. But for now, point B and C are the only options we have. We can produce more of good Y at point B, or we can produce more of good X at point C. But we would be doing it at the expense of the other good when we're producing those. And that is the idea behind this. Should I study more or should I party with my friends? These are trade-offs we make all the time. And this leads to this production possibilities frontier. A business and an economy has to make decisions about what they're going to produce. Are they going to produce more of good Y or more of good X? And this leads to, the discussions that we always have when we're debating costs and benefits of different products we're going to eat. Is it better to have a Whopper, or is it better to have a Five Guys burger? Is it better to have a Big Mac? And what are the trade-offs between those? What are the trade-offs? That leads us to this PPF. Now, if we simplify this model, and we say that we notice there's increasing opportunity cost, which is why we see the bow. We're pushing out every opportunity to make these goods that are possible. But what we notice in the next key graph is that there's a constant opportunity cost. There's a direct relationship between good A and good B. If we produce more of good A, we are producing less of good B, and that is a known fact. Constant opportunity cost goes directly to affect good B. There's no in between. That's the idea of constant opportunity cost. This is also assuming, unrealistically, this is assuming that you could adapt good A for production of good B and vice versa, and that's not always the case. The example we always use here is guns versus butter. If North Korea stopped producing guns, could it really start producing butter? Well, I mean, they're technically yes, but that would take some time and effort and things to go into it. But ultimately, could they get there? Sure. But right away, there would be an adjustment. There would be some growing pains there in terms of trying to address that. And so that's what we look at when we talk about this idea of constant opportunity cost between good A and good B. Now, it's important to note the circular flow here is this idea that the economy begins and ends with you. We talked a lot about that in micro. You're a consumer, but you're also a worker. You're a human resource. You're a factor of production, but you're also a household in that you buy things for your family and things that you need, things that you want. So you are a human resource in that you're being paid as a factor market for those goods and services that you produce, and then you sell those back to the company. Essentially, they pay you for them, and then you use that money to buy other goods and services that your family needs. And that's the idea of the circular flow. The economy begins and ends with you, and that really is the driver here. So important to note, and you can pause the video here to look at each one of these, but it's important to note household is essentially a consumer. It's a group of people, a family, if you will. A firm is a company, it's a business, and they're in the business of selling goods and services to households, to to people that buy those goods and services. And in order to make those goods and services, firms or businesses need to actually use resources, which includes those factors of production we talked about earlier: the land, the labor, the capital, the natural resources, the human resources, and the capital resources to do so. Now, the question is, how do countries decide how they're going to produce? Well, they look at what is their, what we call lower opportunity cost. What is going to, again, opportunity cost is opportunity lost. So where is it going to cost me less to produce something? That is going to be my comparative advantage. So in this case, what we see here is the opportunity cost for the US to make one small jet is 3/4 of a large jet. But for Brazil, it's going to cost them 1/3 of a large jet in order to make a small jet. So they are going to have a smaller opportunity cost in producing that small jet in terms of the large jet they would be producing in so doing. So in terms of large jets, it's going to cost the US 1 1/3 small jets in order to produce the large jet, but it's going to cost Brazil 3 small jets, not 1 1/3, but 3 small jets. So what we see here is that the U.S. has a lower opportunity cost in producing large jets, and so they should actually produce large jets, and Brazil should produce small jets because they have the lower opportunity cost in these particular situations. And thus, this is their comparative advantage. Their comparative advantage is essentially for Brazil in producing small jets and the U.S. in producing large ones because they have the lower opportunity cost. Now, I have a video on just calculating comparative advantage, and I would highly encourage you to check that out because I go into lots of detail there in terms of that calculation of comparative advantage, which I don't do here. But definitely check that video out if you're having trouble or need a clarification on that one, because I think you'll find that helpful. In terms of looking at the comparative advantage, what we find is where the slope of the curve actually favors one side or another, actually that is the comparative advantage. So in this case, what we see here is the U.S. again should be producing large jets because it's favoring it in terms of that side, that slope, and the Brazil should be making the smaller jets because again their slope is favoring the smaller jet side in terms of the comparative advantage, and so that's what they should be producing. So again, U.S., you could look at this and say U.S. is, this one's a little harder to tell, but the U.S. is favoring large jets. It has the comparative advantage in producing large jets, and Brazil definitely in small jets. And thus, again, the question is that I always get from students is, well, what if they don't, what if one country has an absolute advantage in both? Absolute advantage meaning they can produce both more effectively. Well, the idea of comparative advantage is there is a gain from trade. So they wouldn't be trading if they felt like there was no gain from trade for them here. The only reason why they're going to they're going to have a comparative advantage and they're going to trade is because they see there is a benefit to their society in maintaining that trade. Otherwise, they're not going to be looking for a comparative advantage because they would just be producing it themselves. In autarky is what we call that. And we'll get to that in the next chapter on international trade, in chapter 18 on international trade. But they would be in autarky if they weren't trading with others. But in this case, we're assuming there are gains from trade. It is important for them to specialize because they're going to be able to produce more and ultimately consume more in this model, which is what we see here. So comparative advantage versus absolute. Comparative advantage is the idea of having a lower opportunity cost in producing that good and gaining from trade in so doing. Absolute advantage just means you can make more than anybody else. Okay, and that one's easy to look at. You can look at numbers and you can quickly see who has the absolute advantage. In comparative advantage, you're comparing the opportunity costs, and that is what we talked about here. And looking at the lower opportunity cost, that's going to give you the comparative advantage. So in this case, we saw the United States has an absolute advantage in both. But there is a gain from trade with Brazil. So they're going to trade with Brazil because there is an advantage to gaining from trade in terms of a trading partner with Brazil. And so that's the effort that they're looking for here. Comparatively, though, they're looking at where do they have the lower opportunity cost. And that's going to be where they both can benefit from specializing in one production of one good, the small jets or the large jets. And in this case, it is Brazil that should make the small jets and the U.S. the large ones. And that's what we saw in that model. And we saw it in the opportunity cost. We saw it in the graph. Both of those demonstrate this idea. Again, there's a really great video on calculating comparative advantage in which I go through this in great painstaking detail, but I would encourage you to check that one out. It is in my MCPS classroom in the modules section for the reviews of chapters 1, 2, and 3. But this goes into the input method, which is IOU, input other under. When you take the input of the other good, put it under the item that we see here. That is the IOU method. And then we have the output method, which is take the output of the other item and put it over the good that we see here, the OOO method, or output other over that we see here. And again, that video really will help you in taking you through each of those in looking at which person has the lower opportunity cost and thus the comparative advantage. So if we take a look for a second at this input method, again, input other under, and the idea here is we have tie with 60 minutes mowing, 40 minutes trimming. What we see here is input other under method basically takes us to 60 over 40 or 40 over 60 for mowing and trimming respectively. And for Jessica, it's 75 over 90 and 90 over 75. Again, we've taken the input of the other item that they're producing, or in this case, it's a resource that they're doing, and put it under the item that we're looking at. So 60 over 40, 75 over 90. And then when we simplify, what we get is the opportunity cost. And we can see here that Ty has a comparative advantage in trimming lawns, and so he should specialize in trimming lawns, while Jessica has an opportunity, has a comparative advantage in mowing those lawns, and she should specialize in mowing lawns. In looking at this, we can see that Ty has an absolute advantage in producing both in less time, because this is a resource. This is what's going into it, the input method. But the idea here is Ty should focus on trimming, Jessica on mowing. Now, looking at the output method, and again, the overview video goes into more detail on each of these if you want to drill down into those. But the output method is basically saying how much of something can you produce. So Mark and Doreen are producing radios, and the output of the other item goes over the one we're looking at. Okay, so what we see here is, again, Mark's opportunity cost in speakers is 1/3 of a speaker. Doreen's is going to be 1/2 of a speaker in terms of what we see there. So in looking at this, then the output other over, we simplify, leading to 1/3, 1/2, 3, and 2 in these methods, and we see that Mark has a comparative advantage in installing radios. Doreen has the comparative advantage in installing speakers. Again, using that output other over method. How do you know the difference between when to use an input versus an output method? Input method is usually time. How many minutes does it take to actually produce something? Output method is how many products can I produce? How many items, how many lawns can I mow? How many radios can I install? And that is a production, an output. What's being produced, or what output is coming from this. That's the output method that we see here. I hope you found this helpful on the overview, the highlights, of Chapter 2. Again, check out that comparative advantage video. I think you'll find that helpful in going into more detail. And hopefully we'll see you in the highlights on Chapter 3 as we look at supply and demand.